Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. Now, in the context of our special interviews now concerning the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, we're honored to be joined by an eminent scholar in this field. It is Professor Donald Gibson, professor, I believe, of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. And Professor Gibson is the author of a classic study. This is Battling Wall Street, the Kennedy Presidency, published in 1994. Now, to many people, it might come as a surprise to think of President Kennedy portrayed as an antagonist of Wall Street. But what Professor Gibson has done in his book is to illustrate, and I think he proves the case. He makes the definitive statement about the economic policies of the Kennedy administration, that these were certainly not free market. They were what I would call Hamiltonian dirigistic. They were aimed at maximizing economic progress, full employment, rising standards of living, scientific and technological innovation, and indeed a crackdown on various Wall Street and related interests. Professor Gibson, maybe we could just start. I know there's a wealth of material here. What occurred to me was we're dealing with a world where a lot of people don't know who Roger Blau was. And if we could start, maybe you remind us about Kennedy's clash with Roger Blau. That might get us in medias res, and we can take it from there.
Okay. As was the case with a lot of the conflicts that Kennedy was involved in or challenges that he faced when he took office, the confrontation with U.S. Steel seems to have been driven by things very different from what appeared on the surface. On the surface, it could be interpreted as simply a clash over the question of whether or not a certain corporation and other companies along with it have the right to raise the price of steel or not. But if one examines the circumstances and the development of those events, it becomes pretty obvious that the people behind U.S. Steel, which seem to have been, as had been the case for 50 or more years, people around J.P. Morgan and Company, that what they were doing with the steel issue was trying to discredit Kennedy as a president. And he seems to have realized pretty quickly that if he allowed them to win on this question of raising the prices, and the background for that had been that U.S. Steel had agreed, at least implicitly, not to do that so that the unions would accept a deal in which they would get no pay increase for some time. So anyway, if Kennedy had allowed them to renege on their implied agreement, and had allowed them to, in effect, spit in the face of the presidency, he would have been discrediting himself. And he knew that, and as was the case with a number of other events, he decided to move against U.S. Steel and prevent that.
Now, that was, of course, a clash where Kennedy forced them to back down, and he was not shy about mobilizing the inherent powers of the government, right? I believe Robert Kennedy told these people, look, we're going to be looking at your expense accounts and we're going to be reviewing your tax returns, and they got chilled pretty quickly.
And investigating them for price fixing.
For price fixing, right.
Yeah, there were two separate tracks of investigations started by Robert Kennedy, and at least one of those two was still ongoing when JFK was killed. Now, this, I think, points to something bigger, right? If we can agree that Roger Blau is an official of U.S. Steel, he was the sort of the villain of the piece. People remember him, his arrogance, his disregard of the public interest. This, of course, is a Morgan-created corporation, so it takes us right to the heart of Wall Street. In your book, you also talk about a generalized opposition to Kennedy. You talk about the Wall Street Journal. You talk about Henry Luce of Skull and Bones. You talk about John J. McCloy and others. And I wonder if you could, this is an area where people really need to hear quite a bit, and perhaps you could introduce us into these conflicts. at its most central or essential historical level, I think what we were looking at with that was a clash between somebody who expressed, if not embodied, the spirit of progress, that being Kennedy, of course. And on the other side was what in ancient Greek literature might have been called the will to power. And the will to power in this case being expressed by those people you just referred to, the Council on Foreign Relations, Wall Street, banking, oil, networks of people. I'm sorry. Let me, excuse me.
Okay.
And those interests were looking to change the nature of the way the American economy was working, and they wanted to eliminate government from many different areas. And I'm getting interrupted here unexpectedly.
Take your time. We're here.
Okay. So what Kennedy was looking at was a very aggressive effort to reduce the level of government involvement in the economy. And this was really showing up in very explicit terms and in a major way on the international scene. And the upper class in the United States from about 1952 or 3 until 1960 was developing a strategy for global expansion. And the strategy was to be put through the International Monetary Fund. And the idea would be to reduce the role of governments in economies around the world and open them up to private takeover, through the use of wealth based in this country or other parts of the world. Kennedy was really interfering with that entirely because he was a firm believer in the role of the nation state in economic change and development, and was interested in resolving problems through negotiations amongst nations. The upper class wanted to basically open up the world to private takeover.
It sounds as if the issues of globalization and privatization were actually on the agenda even in the late 50s and early 60s, and that Kennedy was on the what can we say? He was on the side of the angels from our point of view when those things were brought up.
Yeah, I think long before the term globalization came into use, perhaps even before the term multinational corporation came into use, the IMF was being redirected to impose this line of arrangements by getting governments out of the control over their import-export relationships, taking away governments' right to control foreign exchange, opening up economies to foreign investment. All of this was put on the agenda during the 1950s at the IMF, which had been for a while a fairly pragmatic and reasonable institution from, let's say, 44 or 5 until about 52. And mostly what it was involved in, of course, was helping Europe recover from World War II. It wasn't until after C. Douglas Dillon and others got control of the IMF in the 50s that it became this sort of agent of the upper class globally.
Now, you distinguish, I guess, we could say the two themes of your book are the opposition, but, of course, the agenda, right? In other words, Kennedy's program of national economic reform. Now, the music tells us we've done our first segment. Maybe in the second segment you can give us an overview of Kennedy's national economic program, which I think has been lost sight of by many researchers today. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C., and we are honored to be joined by Professor Donald Gibson from the University of Pittsburgh, the author of a study which, as far as I know, really stands alone. It is Battling Wall Street, the Kennedy Presidency, 1994. Now, Professor Gibson, we've just talked a bit about the opposition. What about then Kennedy's overall economic agenda, the national program? I think some people would say, well, he wanted to cut taxes, so he must have been a free marketeer. Perhaps others know something about his desire to reform the Federal Reserve. Some might remember the investment tax credit. Maybe you give us the big picture on that.
Kennedy viewed tax policies as well as government spending as just tools by which to do what Alexander Hamilton had promoted at the founding of the country, and that is increasing labor power. And the way to do that, of course, is through the support of and development of technology and science. It is true that Kennedy reduced the taxes on wealthy people. They were above, the top rate was above 90%, where it had been since the early 50s. And Kennedy did cut that down to 70% for what he called unearned income, and then the top rate was 50% for salaries and wages. And that was a significant decrease. But unlike today, the money in those days was kind of moving in a better way. That is, it was being put back into the U.S. economy and a lot of it into industry. And I think he thought that it would increase the amount of money going there. Also, what you just mentioned, the investment tax credit, that was specifically engineered to get American companies to invest in new plant and equipment inside the United States, and then they could deduct a percentage of the value of that investment from their tax obligations. In general, though, the whole idea was to use tax policy to further technology and science in the economy.
And even when we look at the investment tax credit, right, which is obviously it's a great thing to stimulate modernization and innovation, and it's very much anchored in the real economy. You don't get this for speculating with derivatives, but it's also connected, I think, as you read in your book, there are crackdowns or tightenings, for example, about if you have large profits overseas, that those are going to be treated more strictly. Is that correct?
Yeah, Kennedy was definitely interested in slowing down what we've come to know as at least part of globalization, and that is foreign investment. And he wanted to do that by making them pay taxes on those profits, even if they didn't bring them back to the United States. Kennedy was not interested in slowing down investment to the third world. In those days, that was probably understandable because there really wasn't much of any. But what he was trying to do is redirect money into American investment.
All right. Now, how about the famous question of Kennedy and the Federal Reserve, right? Some of us can remember the silver certificates and the United States notes, but what was the larger reality there?
When I was doing that research, the only thing I was ever able to do was simply to get a copy of the presidential directive for that, but I could not get additional information. So all I really know about that is that there was some billions of dollars of those kinds of notes which were printed, and apparently they were spent into the economy rather than being loaned into the economy. But I don't have a lot of additional information about that.
But I think in your book you do have the idea that Kennedy was interested in tightening his own control over the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the chairman of the Board of Governors. He wanted those terms to be contiguous with the presidential term. Am I right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think that's true. And he was also looking for discretionary power to act any time a recession started, that the president could step in and increase spending to prevent a recession from occurring.
But then would be fair to say that if you have these more modern libertarians, Ron Paul enthusiasts and so forth, they would say, well, Kennedy wanted to abolish the Federal Reserve. There's no basis for that.
I don't know of any.
Okay.
I mean, it may have been it might have been a good idea, but I don't know of any plans, or I don't think he ever said that.
How about maybe some other aspects of the national economic program that are not even recalled at all today?
I don't know. The thing, I'd have to think maybe a little bit about that. But
maybe the space program as an economic measure.
I was going to say that I think what really distinguishes Kennedy from, let's say, Roosevelt was the in-depth focus on science and technology, and part of that came to be embodied in the space program. Kennedy was a New Dealer. I don't know of any evidence that he was against much of anything that was part of the New Deal, and he was adding on. He wasn't replacing or changing. He was adding on that emphasis on scientific and technical progress, which was part of NASA.
In your book, you also go back to Roosevelt's famous economic Bill of Rights, the eight or so points from the State of the Union address, 1944, and you remarked that these were then translated into points of the 1960 Democratic Party platform.
Yeah, one of the problems with sociologists doing historical work is sometimes they don't have enough knowledge about certain things. I probably understated Roosevelt's value in my book, not because I didn't like him or respect him. I just didn't fully grasp at the time how vast the programs were that he did try to implement, and certainly that was part of it.
My own reading of Kennedy is that this was an attempt to restart the New Deal, to revive it after it had been really betrayed by Truman and then sort of put on ice by Eisenhower, and that he wanted to do it in a more modern form.
I think that's true.
And then if we get to Kennedy as a person now, I know one of your points is that Kennedy had essentially educated himself, right? He had gone to prep school, I guess, and then he'd gone on to Harvard, but that his view of economics was not the standard academic one, but it was something much more highly developed, right? As you were saying before, Hamiltonian, right? What I would call dirigism.
I think that's definitely the case. He was not a Keynesian. Keynesianism is really a very gross attempt to counter, declines or depressions or recessions. It is in no way a program or a plan to try and develop an economy. And what Kennedy was laying out was that focused program that would contribute in some way to our real ability to produce things, as opposed to where the economy, of course, has gone over the last 25 or 30 years toward basically financial gains.
Right. And how did Kennedy do this? I mean, did you get any insight into that? What was he reading? Who was he listening to? Or how did this somehow get reflected in appointments, or did it ever?
I don't have enough knowledge about especially second or third or fourth level appointments in the government. I think he, as you said, I think he did develop this mostly out of his own thinking and reading, although clearly influenced by a lot of people. In the case of Roosevelt, I think he considered himself, as you said, to be a New Dealer. His father actually was a wholehearted supporter of much of Roosevelt's program. And so some of
Hang on one second, hold the thought. We've got our music going. The hard break is upon us. We'll be back in a minute with Professor Donald Gibson. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. And we are very happy to be joined today by Professor Donald Gibson of the University of Pittsburgh. He is the author of, I think, an irreplaceable, really unique study on Kennedy. It's called Battling Wall Street, the Kennedy Presidency, published 1994. So I think what we have so far is that Kennedy was not a free marketeer. He's not an Austrian or a Friedmanite in today's terms.
Absolutely not.
And he's not a Keynesian.
No.
So that makes him, I guess you've said, a Hamiltonian, right? The American system of political economy?
Yes.
All right.
And I think that was fairly conscious, although that term may not have been, was probably not very much in use any place at that time, the American system.
The thing that I think you've done with this book is when you try to talk about the American system or talk about this tradition of political economy, you're forced back to people like Hamilton or Henry Clay or Friedrich List or Henry Carey. You can bring it up to Roosevelt. Maybe the theoretical part is not so highly developed in the 20th century. But what I see in your book is the starting point for rebuilding today. In other words, if you wanted to know what are starting points for even beginning to think about the problems we have today, with Kennedy, it's 50 years old now, but still, it's a whole generation closer to us than the actual original New Deal, and certainly much closer than the 19th century models. And therefore, if you were going to develop a program today, this would be a starting point.
I think so, and the book for me was very, very, very easy to write. And it was very easy to write because of the coherence of Kennedy. That everything he did, everything he touched, every aspect of government spending was almost, if not always, almost always connected to his overall goal of doing what he had promised to do and getting the country moving again and generating the kind of prosperity that allows the country the freedom to do things.
Now, I want to conclude here with the idea that people should get your book, and this then brings up a problem. I was just looking in the last day or two if you want to get a copy of Battling Wall Street on. It is available on Amazon, but it looks like it's out of print. And well, there's always this question, right? Habet sua fata libelli. Books have their destinies. Can you tell us the story of your book? I know I interviewed you on a cable television program. It must be 15 years ago, but how is it that this book has been allowed to be out of print? How does that come about?
Well, it was published by Sheridan Square Press, and they were sued out of existence. So my book was one of the last things they did. And they were sued by an international arms trafficker and a top-level official of George H.W. Bush's government. And there were parallel multi-billion-dollar suits, and they couldn't even handle the legal, they couldn't even really respond in court. They didn't have the resources. So they closed down.
Are you at liberty to say who the Bush official is?
I believe it was Baker.
James Baker III.
I believe that's who it was, yeah.
James Baker III he was feted here in Washington at the Kennedy Center, ironically, for his career, right? The M.D. Anderson Cancer Center of Texas has celebrated James Baker III.
Yeah.
So if people want to get your work, what should they do?
I have not seen this in a long time, but I haven't looked for it. There are people who've put this on the internet, and I just haven't done anything about that or with it. And I'm sorry, I can't tell people where to go offhand. But if they perhaps start poking through some of the websites just off of the book's title, they might eventually find where they can just print it.
Well, I don't know if I've found the entire book, but if it's okay with you, I would just say one place where I found extensive excerpts. Is that all right?
Yeah.
I don't want to undermine your royalties.
Well, I don't get any I don't get any royalties.
Anyway, the Daily Kos, right? KOS, net roots, right? The Daily Kos on Sunday, February 11th, 2007. Published some excerpts, Battling Wall Street, the Kennedy Presidency, Part 1. And then, a little bit later, let's see exactly when, on Monday, February 12th, 2007, we have Battling Wall Street, the Kennedy Presidency, Part 2. And with these, you get a significant selection, although I'm afraid some things that I would have wanted to read about, the international economic part, that that chapter didn't seem to interest them at all, and that's a big mistake, I would say, in the world of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But it is there. Any idea where that copyright has landed?
Oh, I supposedly have the copyright.
So the copyright is not with you anymore?
No, I do have it, supposedly.
Well, I would, from this time and place, I would urge people in the audience, right? If you are a professor or you have any influence on drawing up curricula, this would be a book to assign, right? If you got a class of undergraduates or even graduates these days, this would be a great piece of reading, and maybe there's a way to gin up some demand and get this reprinted. If you go to Lulu or someplace like this, they can do on demand very, very easily.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought of that? The idea of publishing on demand. This is now quite pervasive, and it seems it's really in the public interest. I mean, I would appeal to you from the public interest that you ought to find a way to make this available for a new generation, because it is, as I say, really unique in the genre. Am I right that it's the only one that deals with this subject in this way?
Yeah.
Well,
a couple of the
unique.
better. Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say Ted Sorensen and one or two other people perhaps devoted a paragraph or two to the topic. And that made them better than most people who wrote on it, on Kennedy. But so yes, it is. There's nothing else like it.
Well, I hope we can stay in touch. And again, take a look at Lulu or something like this. You can send them an electronic manuscript, and they'll have it, right? And then people can buy it from them, and they can also make sure that it's worth your while too. Or maybe I can put you in touch with a publisher that I know.
Well, I'd certainly be interested.
All right, that's there's our music. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, but I hope that this book can be relaunched because it is unique. Thank you so much, Professor Gibson.